Primitive Man is one of those bands that the first time I saw them live, I didn't really know their music ahead of time, and then they absolutely blew me away. I was so blown away that afterwards I went up to the Primitive Men themselves and said, that was the heaviest thing I've ever heard, and I meant it, and the Primitive Men said thank you, so that was nice. This video is a few very short thoughts about the riff from the middle of the opening track of their first album, which was also the song that they opened with, and that made me say, this is the heaviest thing I've ever heard. So from what I can tell, what's happening is something like this. We have two sounds in this riff, each of which lasts for a full measure of 4/4. First, there's a B flat in the bass, doubled an octave up and with a major third above that, so a D natural. And then there's an A flat in the bass with an A natural above. It's a cool idea. It moves from a point of stability with the octave B flats to a point of relative instability, where the two voices move down by different amounts. So the upper voice moves down by a half step, but the bass moves down by a whole step. So we get this crunchy minor ninth on the second chord. As a kind of aside, I love it when bands use major thirds, which, if you're explaining music theory to a toddler, are the happy interval, in this really muddy register. They sound so evil and heavy. A kind of back burner idea that I'm fleshing out slowly is that the more out there doom metal is full of these types of idiosyncratic tonal systems that don't really have much to do with common practice chords, but still play with stability and instability. But backing up a second, it's hard to just brush past that from what I can tell. So from what I can tell, because if I'm talking about harmony at all, I have to acknowledge that it's pretty hard to tease out exactly what's happening here, what with all the distortion and how low everything is. These two things conspire especially to make it very easy to hear overtones. Like, I'm sure there's that D natural up above the B flat on the first time they go through this riff, on the first chord. But it also definitely fades out after. But it's also there in the overtones, and it's pretty easy for me to keep hearing it for the rest of the song. So we kind of have to deal with these ambiguities that are baked into this type of music with distorted guitars, and especially distorted guitars with really low fundamental pitches. A temptation for a budding music theorist might be to try to name these chords. If this was jazz comping, I would call this a B flat major chord and then an A major seventh chord, maybe, depending on how much inferring of notes from overtones I want to do. But I think that here, and in a fair amount of metal, this impulse should be resisted. What's important here is the repeated downward motion and the way that the two layers move by different amounts, and the way that this happens in the context of the crushing, muddy low end and the super crusty distortion. If these were just notes on a staff or notes in the middle of a piano, we might think of them as chords. But because of all this stuff, I don't think it really makes sense to think of them as chords per se, at least not in any traditional sense, or at least not beyond the idea that a chord is just any time you have multiple notes playing at once. Talked in a few places on this channel about how tempo matters when we're talking about rhythm and meter. You can't just make things arbitrarily fast or slow without fundamentally changing what they are, even if that's the only thing you're changing. Here's an abstract corollary. Range, so tessitura, how high or low the sound is, and timbre matter for harmony. The same notes might sound like chords in one context, but if you make them low and play them with a ton of distortion, it might no longer make sense to think of them as chords, which is what I think is happening here. Postscript. People have pointed out that I do a lot of stuff with progressive and technical metal on this channel, which is almost uniformly true, though that was never something I specifically decided to do. A lot of the music I like and know well is progressive and technical, but that isn't the full story. It's mainly because writing scripts is the hardest part of making these videos, and I find it much easier to write scripts about prog riffs, because prog songs do fancy things with notes that music theory helps to describe. If you transcribe a prog riff and kind of just explain what's happening, it feels like you've already done some work. With non-proggy stuff, though, I find that the music theory concepts I reach for don't generally get at what's cool about the music. This is kind of unfortunate because there's a ton of music that isn't proggy that I really like, and one of my main love languages for music happens to be analysis. This video, which was surprisingly hard to write, was a few thoughts about how talking about non-proggy music will probably mean not repurposing, but entirely disinheriting some of those music theory concepts that get a lot of use in analyzing prog. I always like hearing what you think, but I will especially enjoy it for this video because these thoughts aren't super well formed. What should music theory do with timbre? Does doing away with the idea of chords actually gain anything for talking about this riff? Is my characterization of mainstream music theory a straw man? It is my will that you let me know down below. See ya.